Hi, everybody, and welcome to Backstage. We are doing this in April of 2021. I don't know when you people will be looking at it, or maybe another generation looking at it, but we're just coming out of the pandemic. And so schools are coming to an end and hoping that next year everybody will be back and will be sort of normal. We have a special guest today. We always have special guests. But if you want to have some fun, just Google Antonio Garcia and be prepared to read all the names of anybody in the jazz field who is anybody. And Tony has worked with them or written for them. He's written books. He's head of the jazz program at Virginia Commonwealth University, etc. It goes on. He's been around the world. He's done it. He's the real deal. But all of that pales in comparison to the great personality he is. And he's a dear friend. How are things going in Richmond, Virginia, Tony?
Well, thanks for asking, Tim, and thanks for having me here on Backstage. It's an honor. Things are going pretty well, all things considered. And in light of the pandemic, when anyone might be viewing this in the 50 years from now, we've done pretty well in Virginia. So we've been in-person instruction at VCU for all but 5 weeks since last August. And our students are, matter of fact, giving a concert tonight. We've got 8 concerts in April. To make happen, all live, some hybrid. So things are going all right. Thank you for asking.
Oh, it's a good way to see you make it work under any circumstances. Would you give us a thumbnail sketch, Tony, of your background and like that so everybody knows?
Well, as I like to say, I chose my parents carefully because I was born in New Orleans, and that really helped. Looking in retrospect, that was a good choice. So I chose my parents carefully. AM radio was freewheeling, especially in New Orleans, but there were no, playlists. So you got to hear pop music, but at the same time, all this great New Orleans music that happened. There were 6 kids in the family. I was 5th out of 6, and all of us studied some form of music. My parents were not musicians, but they encouraged it. But at the same time, I gave up piano lessons when I was probably 8 or 9 because I'd started them, but they were on Saturday mornings in the summer, and I was missing the Superman Batman hour, and I was not happy about it. So I told my folks, I got to quit this piano stuff. This is not working for me. And so that was my astute start as a musician. I had asthma, so there were reasons why I shouldn't have been playing the trombone later. But and in my high school, we didn't have a jazz band until my senior year. So I don't think I'd even heard about Miles Davis or Charlie Parker really until I was a freshman at Loyola University there. But I was hearing a lot of great music. There was no question about it. And that made a huge difference just growing up in that environment. My first public gigs were probably, other than playing with some friends, was probably playing in front of 80,000 people at the Superdome in New Orleans, because my band director at Loyola, Joe Hebert, who I'm sure you know, he directed the New Orleans Saints Band, and he hired mostly pros, but also some of his students to help educate them. And so I would sight read in front of 80,000 people every other Sunday. And every 6 weeks or so, I'd get to maybe solo on the Saints Go Marching In. And this was a great education. And then later he recommended me to sub it, as when everyone apparently who owned a trombone was busy. I got to sub at the Fairmont Hotel's Blue Room Supper Club when I was a sophomore in college. Backing up at that time was Vicky Carr, but 2 weeks later was like Ella Fitzgerald, and 2 weeks later was George Shearing, and 2 weeks later was Billy Eckstine. 2 shows a night, for 2 weeks at a time, while I was a sophomore in college. So I was getting an incredible education, learning, inside and outside of the school, and that I never took that for granted. So I had a lot of problems playing the trombone and playing jazz, and I tell my students I was a very late bloomer. I didn't play my first decent jazz solo until my mid-20s. But all the struggles that I had as a player and as of the instrument and in jazz ended up that I discovered I had strengths as a teacher. Once I'd learned how to play and write well, and of course I'm still trying to play and write well better tomorrow, but it gave me a special understanding of the challenges that my potential students had, and so that pivoted me into that. And for the last decades, I guess I started teaching full-time in '87, so I taught for 6 years at Northern Illinois University, running the jazz program there, 8 years at Northwestern, running the combo program there. And then since 2001, I've been at VCU and really enjoy it here in Richmond the last 20 plus years, 20 years.
You know, Tony, you dropped those names, Ella Fitzgerald, Lord Cherry, and I'm like,
yeah, me too.
You couldn't buy an education like that if you wanted to. You couldn't put it together.
No, it's one of the reasons also why I left a tenured position at Northwestern University to come here at VCU, because there are relatively few places where a student can have those kinds of experiences outside of the school while being in school as an undergrad. And for jazz, I think Richmond, Virginia, and New Orleans, Louisiana are two of those cities at a low cost of living. You might have those experiences in New York or LA or various other cities that have wonderful opportunities, but it's also going to cost you to live there. And so my students here have a lot of the same kinds of experiences, not always with an Ella or a Billy Eckstine, but they have tremendous amounts of playing jazz and commercial music opportunities as soon as they walk out of the door of school. And that's something that I felt was essential to my scenario for teaching. And so my students graduate with some business savvy here and a lot of musical experience that maybe isn't possible at a lot of other great schools because of where we are. You could throw $5 million at a city and say, create this vibe, and they couldn't do it.
Yeah. You know, a lot of teachers watch this, obviously, and we're in the teaching field, and you know, we're so glad that you're one of our Bach clinicians and the head of the jazz part for Conn-Selmer Institute. But can you talk about, I didn't know Joe Aber was your band director.
Oh yeah. I mean, and he was my band director when I was still in high school. So and I had so many mentors along the way. You know, in high school, I had a gentleman named Marion Kaluta and a gentleman named Logan Boudreau, and they both, you know, they introduced me to opportunity. Joe, well, let's put it this way: Marion Kaluta allowed me to play a jazz solo on the football field before that was ever possible. You know, nobody would do that, and he allowed me to rearrange a piece for concert band to feature the trombone section, and gave me, you know, one of my first writing opportunities. And Logan Boudreau started the jazz band there in my senior year. And so those were great things. And then while I was there, I was going to summer band at Loyola University, summer music camp, jazz and classical. So I had older sisters who had gone there. And so you know, Joe Aber was considered to be part of the musical family. And so I started concert band under him, but also jazz band. And in those opportunities, I got a chance to write music for the first time for big band. And the kid in front of me soloing on alto sax was some guy named Branford Marsalis. You know, the guy behind me was some guy named Winton. The next year was Donald Harrison and Terrence Blanchard. So I was learning like crazy because I was surrounded by like-minded people who loved the music, who wanted to learn, but also knew more than I. And so when I went on to Loyola University to study there, and I had great mentors, not only Doc Aber, aside from all the music that he gave me, you know, the music that he taught me, when I applied to get into, I went, well, he was running the jazz program. My second year in, he brought in a guy named John Mahoney to run the jazz program. And you may have met John. And John is a trombonist, pianist, vocalist, educator. So that sounds familiar. I mean, that's really my bailiwick. So John obviously influenced me. And besides all the teaching that they did, John was the person who recognized when I was graduated, he said, you know, I can't really recommend you at this point as a graduate school jazz player, which was true because I wasn't really that developed at that time as a jazz player. He said, but I think I can recommend you as a writer. And I never thought of that. And that changed my life. And I applied to Eastman and they didn't take me, which was a good decision at that time. And I had a gig that night with Doc Aber playing with a society band, a Jubilation, a great rock pop band. And he was playing bass. And I told him on the break, I said, I got my rejection letter from Eastman. And he said, well, how about this? How about you come back to Loyola for an extra year, low cost. You play in our ensembles. In return, write for us, write everything you can write. And we'll play it. If it's good enough, we'll record it and all that. That changed my life too. So John and Joe changed my life way beyond the curriculum. And then I went on to Eastman and had those mentors, Ray Wright and Bill Dobbins, wonderful things there. Again, constant elevation from my mentors way beyond just teaching the notes and the music. So I'm blessed, but it also motivates me, of course, to high power give back to my students, because I stand on the shoulders of folks who rescued my sorry butt and made things happen.
Well, in fact, I was talking to a group of college kids last night, and I said, relationships are such an important part of our profession. And of course, you just affirmed that and confirmed that. And to all the directors out there, I'm not sure sometimes they realize how powerful their words are. Because in this case, had you not played that job that night, you might not have gone back to Loyola, and
Oh,
then
yeah. Totally. And relationships, I teach music business here as also, and I tell the students at the start, I said, you're going to have 15 guest lecturers this semester besides me. And I guarantee you that at least 11 out of the 15 are going to mention relationships as being the most important thing for you, for your career. And, if you want to have if you're going to pay a plumber $60 an hour to come fix stuff in your house, you're certainly going to lean towards one that you can get along with, who makes you feel like at least it was worth the time and the money, and you weren't getting savaged throughout about, the whole plumbing problem and people traipsing through your house or whatever. It's relationships. And so it's critical in the music industry as well as any industry. And I also say to my students, I believe firmly we get into music because of the music, how it makes us feel, but we stay in the music because of the people we meet and the vibe. Because if we all played great music but could only play with lousy people, we'd all quit within a month. There's no way we would sit next to each other and play great music with lousy people over and over and over again. There's something about that magnet of music that draws personalities and relationships that largely, not always, but mostly, really uplifts us. And so the relationships that we form are critical for our industry, for our career, for our lives, in ways that we can't, expect. Certainly band directors have been documented in many studies, band and orchestra directors over and over again, choral directors as well, about being an anchor for their students in high schools and middle schools way beyond music. That often it's the reason why they show up to school, the students show up to school, is because of music class and the relationship that they have with their director. So we can't take it for granted.
Well, the number of bands you've played with, ditto. The breakup of the band is rarely about music.
Oh yeah, right.
Personalities, right?
Agreed.
And so that, again, the whole communication skill, et cetera, et cetera. I know that a lot of people are going to watch this immediately, Tony. What are your thoughts about the whole COVID climate and how they should deal with it, and with the kids coming back, et cetera?
Well, of course, we all hope for just getting back to normal and having it be better than normal. Certainly few of us will take it for granted when things are back to normal, and that'll make it better. But there are some silver linings if we do have to, for the times that we have to be more in a remote scenario. And one of them is certainly that our outreach is further than ever. I mean, you and I and others have certainly done workshops as far as we can travel, but the bottom line is in 10 seconds, we can be anywhere in the world and sharing thoughts and helping people. And we do. And so that's a silver lining. We're now better equipped. We understand more about the technology. We get better sound, all those things. So that's great. We can share resources from our computers like this. Here's this score, here's this music, here's a variety of things that I've created. And so that is a lot different than having to stuff it in a suitcase. So for all the tragedy involved and for the harm that it's done to music education, no doubt, there's at least some silver lining there. And one of the silver linings that I've found also is that if we have to deal with remote teaching in various situations, there's a lot of concern about latency, about being able to play together simultaneously. But there's so many things we can do that are not latency affected. So, if I play a chord on my keyboard, which I believe you can hear now. So, if I play a chord on my keyboard, I can have my students play themes over it, whether they're written or improvised. I can have them arpeggiate and do scales, and I can really sense whether they understand the tools of the trade. They can play ideas. I can play ideas back. So there's a lot of things that maybe if we were in the same room at the same time, we might miss. But the fact that we're one-on-one and have to take a moment to pause and listen to each other, we can gain there. But certainly the best silver lining is simply the degree of outreach. I mean, it's really amazing how many people we can reach and how far. And but nothing replaces in person. Nothing replaces the wash of sound, the vibrations that we have. And even the 6 feet apart vibrations that my students have had for 9 months it's good, but doesn't replace being packed on the stage like the Village Vanguard and having people shoulder to shoulder making music. That kind of musical vibration is something that's healthy for us. It speaks to us physically as well as mentally. So I'm looking forward back to the time when we can get shoulder to shoulder and packed in like sardines again.
I know that when you look at your resume, and I was teasing about it sort of at the beginning, that you've been around the world literally several times with these incredible names. So what is it they say? The overnight wonder is like 30 years old or has invested 30 years. How important has this been for you to know all of these people, to hitchhike to the next people and so forth? Because your career is like, wow, how did you do all of that?
Well, you're very kind. Well, I always tell my students that I am one of the most organized people that
Yes.
I've met.
Yes.
But I've never planned my career. And I've only planned how to grow. And I think if my students or anyone does that, if our listening directors and college students do that, I think that bodes very well. I have nothing against people who plan their career and say, okay, well, by 25, I want to be doing this. By 30, I want to be doing it. But if I had tried that, I would have failed miserably at any of those benchmarks. It never happens when I want to happen. What I do is I do my best work. I see what doors it opens. I go through the best door available. I do my best work. I see what doors it opens. I do best work that I can. It opens certain doors. I go through the best door available. I rinse and repeat and do the same thing. And that's been my entire career. And so most of the things that have meant most in my career are things that were not available to me when I wanted them, or I was either turned down or couldn't even have tried. I mean, one of the great benchmarks of my career was becoming editor of the IJE Jazz Education Journal. But when they first approached me about potential interest, I was too busy to take it. But about a year later, they hadn't filled the position and I was more available. I wanted to get into Eastman, but like I said, the first time they didn't take me. But the second time I got in, I was far more prepared and ready to take full advantage of it. The first teaching position I got, Northern Illinois University. Well, I didn't get that the first time it came up. I got that the second time it came up a year later. These are just, it's just part of life. And so I tell my students that no never means no in your career. No means not yet, or maybe not with these folks, or maybe you have to get better or whatever. But the only time it means no for your career is when you decide it means no and it's time for you to move on from some branch to some other branch. But it never means no. I have a specialty, I believe, in my career of making a list of the things that I have been denied in my career. And part of them are over here on this board over here. And I make that list. And every now and then, every few years, I go back to it and I see, have the people in charge moved on? Have I gotten better? Am I more informed? Maybe I should look at this again, because, I get these things, they happen 25 years later sometimes. Some things just happen 6 months later, but 25 years later, like, that's an excellent idea. I'm glad you thought of that. I think we should do that. So, no never means no.
And that's great wisdom, because the only way you can fail is to quit.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
And my
father and mother, who are very wise people, my father put a quote, said something that I quote on my website. He said, there's a difference between stress and distress. Told me this when I was a teenager. He said, if you want to grow, you're going to have stress. Growing is going places you haven't gone before with yourself, your life, your vision, your knowledge. And you're going to have stress because you don't know what the heck you're doing. You're growing. Distress, that's different. Distress is things are going wrong. Somebody's getting hurt. Things need to change. We got to fix this. This is bad news. That's distress. You should limit distress as much as possible in your life. Said, but stress, said, doesn't bother me. Doesn't bother me either. I mean, I could choose on a moment's decision. At some points I will say, oh, I need to divest this. I need to slow this down. I need to do less of this or whatever. But I enjoy the stress that comes from having to grow and do a lot of challenging things, and sometimes at the same time. I like that. Distress, I'm not interested in. I want to limit that. I want to eliminate that as much as possible. But I tell my students, like, if you want to do wonderful things and grow to do things you didn't do yesterday, you're going to have a lot of stress. If you like that level of tension, you'll probably be a career musician just fine. But if you don't like that, you probably shouldn't, because you only want to do things that are comfortable. And my life has been a journey of learning how to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, and I enjoy that.
Yeah, that's great. Being uncomfortable with it. Yeah, that's great.
Well, it's a jazz thing too. I mean, you can't possibly, you've played jazz drums, and so you can't possibly walk into a room of other people, and especially ones you don't know, to play music you don't know what's going to be, right, and in front of people you've never met before, and a sound system that may or may not be there, or whatever else, and may or may not have had dinner, and make music unless you're comfortable with the uncomfortable. And jazz musicians revel in that.
Yeah, they look forward to it.
Yeah.
You said something a little bit ago, and I laughed out loud because it's so true. Literally one of the most organized people I know. How important, because our jazz community is kind of known for, well, didn't have it put all together, or we forgot it, or whatever.
Right.
Talk to me about how important organization is in everything you do.
Well, it's important to me because it's how I'm wired. But I have to say that my biggest challenge as an educator is teaching folks who are not wired as I am. And I recognize that. So if I was to call myself, for instance, concrete sequential, which is one way of assessing what I do. It's like, here's a list. I got to do this. If I want to make this happen, that's going to go. And then there's Random Abstract, which is the title of an album by Branford Marsalis, who titled his album that way in reflection that he felt as the two brothers. He's Random Abstract, and Wynton Marsalis is Concrete Sequential. And so when that album came out, I started looking at this. It was decades ago. I'm like, what is this term? What's going on? And because obviously they're both very accomplished human beings, much less musicians, and they're great people. I'm like, well, but they're wired differently, And so I have a pretty direct path helping someone who follows lists as I do and can see ahead in a series of steps. But a concrete sequential person may not be a fan of lists, may not even be able to stick to a list, but learns quite as much, or in some ways even more. So a concrete sequential person sees the list, whereas a random abstract sees whatever's shiny at the moment, like, wow, that's interesting, let me dive into that. Wow, look at that. Wow, that's interesting. And so the plan falls by the wayside, yet the person learns maybe more about the bigger picture and the possibilities than the concrete sequential ever will, because the concrete sequential is going down the list, maybe has some blinders on, and unless a surprise happens, maybe he doesn't get pulled to the side to see what else is out there. And I've had a lot of surprises, so I've been pulled to the side, but a random abstract person is always being pulled to the side. So I'm constantly trying to read and discover and talk to educators about how they work with random abstract students, because that is the biggest challenge of my career, bar none. I have students every year, at least every other year, who don't follow lists. That's not because they don't want to. It's just that's not how they're wired. So if you have any information on that, anyone out there that you can share with me that you think I haven't run into, I am keen to learn, amongst many other things. Just shoot it to me at ajgarcia at vcu.edu, AJ Garcia at vcu.edu, and hit me up, because the reason why I get to be so darn smart is because I learn from people who are smarter than I am. So I'm happy to soak up that information. But yeah, it's very helpful for me to be concrete sequential, but for other people, it doesn't do anything.
I'm going to throw a couple words at you here as we turn the corner and head for the finish line.
Yeah.
And this will be a fun one, because I think we both lean on this one. Communication. How important is communication?
Oh, it's everything, because relationships are everything. So building block of relationships, communication. Certainly in the real life world, I don't think I need to explain to anyone watching about how relationships work, but it's communication is everything. There's a guest speaker I bring to my business class who says communication can't be overdone. Right. And I take that with a grain of salt, because I tend to overdo it, but at the same time I get results. So I tend to communicate pretty heavily with people, and I receive 30,000 emails a year. My clicker tells me that it's 30,000 a year, and that's after the spam filter. 30,000 emails a year. That's just emails. The communication is everything. Yeah, it's well over 100 a day.
Yeah,
And,
that's exactly what I was doing.
yeah, and you're probably, this is not no different from yours, but 30,000 emails a day. So that's not counting the phone or mail or actual human interaction. 30,000 emails a year. So, communication can be overdone, but bottom line is, if you can't take the heat, you got to get out of the career.
Yeah.
You can't really have it both ways. You can't say I'm going to build a career without relationships, and I can't say I'm going to build relationships without communication. So communication is everything.
Well, those two are, I mean, they're brother sister, right? Because communication is the fuel for trust relationships. Trust relationships has to have communication to continue to be robust.
It's one of the reasons why the Conn-Selmer Institute is one of my favorite places to teach on the planet, because the communication and the relationships are there. Yes, we exchange information, but the person-to-person interaction in and out of the classroom, things that happen out in the greens, things that happen over the dinner table, that level of communication is something that is harder to achieve at a typical conference. It's not impossible, but it's harder because there's so much going on with so many people. Even at the Midwest Clinic, where you and I are both board members of the beloved organization, but there are, in a given week, 17,000 people around, and a very but the Conn-Selmer Institute, maybe there's 300, maybe 500 people there and attendees, and it's a family atmosphere. And the atmosphere is ripe for not just the sharing of information, which is wonderful, but for the establishment of family, of really establishing lifelong relationships that tie into learning how to teach, learning how to learn, and not being embarrassed at any point about raising your hand and saying, "Hey, what did you just say? I never heard that before. What's that? Where are you going with this? This could change my life." And I've certainly had my life raised, elevated many times by not only the attendees at the Conn-Selmer Institute, but by the fellow educators who are there, and certainly by the staff who rock my world. So communication and relationships are two cornerstones of what happens at the Conn-Selmer Institute.
One last thing, because I think, like you said, there's many things from the pandemic that have surfaced that we should have been tapping long ago, but now it's obvious. How important is it for education and music industry to work together?
Oh yeah, hand in glove, boy, I tell you, those partnerships, make such a great difference. I mentioned the Conn-Selmer Institute as an example, and certainly I mentioned the Midwest Clinic as an example. The Midwest Clinic was formed 75 years ago as a reading clinic, a partnership between educators and publishers of new music, and continues this day as being one of its primary missions is bringing new music out, as well as recent music out, as publications for band and orchestra directors. That kind of synergy makes things possible. And then just the idea of actual instruments. I was reflecting earlier this morning when I saw a picture from my past, and I thought it was a picture in my office of Ray Brown, the great bassist, playing a bass on stage with Mike Coker, a pianist now at Arizona faculty, but he was with me at Northwestern at the time, and I'm playing trombone, because we had hosted Ray Brown at one point, and Ray is playing a student bass. Mm-hmm. And that student said afterwards, "I was going to sell that bass. I thought that bass was horrible." Like, Ray Brown sounded unbelievable, right? And we had hosted Max Roach, and Max Roach plays on the student drum set, makes it sound great. Louis Belson, the same thing. Could have, a great trumpeter like a Doc Severinsen or pick up anything and make it sound good. But that's because they already know how they want to sound and how to create that sound as best possible. So there are very few hindrances, no matter what the instrument. But for someone growing on the instrument as starters, in middle school, high school especially, to have access to quality instruments affects everything about how they learn to play that instrument, because it's formative at that point. And there are obstacles. And if the instrument isn't really good, if not great, it's not going to be the same for that student learning that instrument. It's different than if a John Faddis picks up the instrument, and they're going to be able to make a great sound on anything. So the partnership between industry and music education has been great, not only for education as a whole in terms of things like conferences and Conn-Selmer Institute, but just in the sense of getting the instrument out. And if folks do go to the Conn-Selmer Institute, I hope they'll take advantage of the chance to go tour the factory and see where these instruments are made, and realize, as I had forgotten, and I've been a Conn-Selmer artist for many years, but playing the instruments since I think 1979. This instrument right here is 1979, as a matter of fact. And but I had forgotten that it's all American made, and the only all American made instruments. And so it's a special time in our history, I think, for us to, as Americans also, if those of us, any of us watching happen to be Americans today, watching, to think, yeah, well, maybe I should be checking that out. So when you go and you realize the family, literal family that's involved in the Conn-Selmer factory, as well as the figurative family of the Conn-Selmer staff putting it together, and you really get a chance to see that partnership and how it works for education. It's a life-changing thing. It certainly has changed my life, between my tenor and my bass trombones.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I told you this 30 minutes would go fast.
Oh, yeah.
Any last thoughts for all of our people out there as we head down to the next part of navigating these uncharted waters that we're in right now?
Well, it is uncharted. And I think for my own students, I've certainly noticed that as many stresses and anxieties as they've had previous years, it's only been compounded by not only the COVID crisis, but the racial strife that we're going through, and economic strife brought on by job losses in the family and health issues. I mean, so very often I find myself saying, certainly when I was in Zoom classes, but now even in person, I say, look, we made it to Thursday.
Yeah.
And at the end of class, say, let's make it to Friday. Yeah. I think it's important for us to sometimes we just got to look and say, this is an achievement. We have gotten through an entire day. And, maybe we took that for granted before, but we can't take that for granted anymore. There's too many obstacles for us to take it for granted. So we should celebrate every darn day and say, look, we made it to today. Now let's make it to tomorrow. And if you need help along the way, call out, let me know. If
Yes.
Let's support each other. So that's my final call, is let's make it to tomorrow. And if you need help, let us know. Let's figure it out together, because tomorrow's worth making it to.
That's great advice. A yes, no question, and then I'll let you go. Will you come back and do this again with us?
Oh, you're very kind. I'd be honored. I'm off the charts honored to be part of Backstage this time, and always proud to be a Conn-Selmer clinician and to have an affiliation with the great family at Conn-Selmer, and especially with my good friend, Dr. Tim. So thank you so much for having me. I'm honored.
Well, echoed times infinity back to you. Please, excuse me, tell Mary I said hi.
I will.
I love you, pal. You are the best. And for everybody out there, any opportunity you can get in your life to bump in to Tony Garcia, you will have a friend for life. That's the first thing. And secondly, it makes the Library of Congress look like a beginning book. You have so much information to share.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks. Yeah, and Tony's going to come back and see us. Thanks to all of you for being here on Backstage. We'll see you next time. In the meantime, let the music begin. All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.